For me, so I hear.
All right.
Anyway.
Okay. My name is Tunde Zack-Williams. I'm one of the editors of the Review of African Political Economy. This afternoon, I have the privilege of interviewing Marjorie Mbilinyi, who is a long-time activist of the left in Africa, not just in Tanzania. So it's a privilege, Marjorie. Welcome to this interview.
Thank you very much.
First of all, what do you make of the conference so far?
No, I think it's been a wonderful conference. As I call it, bubbly. Because we are, from the very first day, succeeding in allowing people to speak out their different ideas about things. But I think we have a general agreement about the substance of what we are discussing in terms of how to promote progressive politics, build a social movement within the present context of neoliberal domination and growing totalitarianism without always talking about it out loud in our respective countries in Africa today, and promoting an alternative worldview that we associate with. I think many people still are saying associate with socialism. I use the concept of transformative feminism, which incorporates socialism. We incorporated socialism from the beginning in what we were doing, but it's trying to go beyond just socialism to pay attention to transformations in private life as well as the public life.
Thank you. Marjorie, at a time when reactionary forces seem to be on the ascendancy,
Yes.
what role do you feel a conference like this in the last couple of days can do?
It's a very important contribution in creating a space, a safe space for raising these kind of critical views. But here, what's very important is it's not just doing a critique of the present situation, the present exploitation, and so on. Obviously, people are sorting through what are the tools of analysis that will make the difference in terms of building a movement. And since we're constantly referring to the idea of building a movement, it means we have to be practical. We have to be dealing with the action component of what we're doing as well. Although at the beginning we began, I thought, to be a bit textbook about fast this and that. But I think we've gone beyond that now. And people are really interested to know what have people already been doing in their own location, especially the panel this morning and what people have talked about it. Existing kinds of form of organizing, not all of which are working class, proletariat-led forms of organizing. And what can we learn from them, regardless of what we're moving forward? But I think a lot of us are also searching for what is a possibility that is not just within our nation state or national boundaries, but for Pan-Africanism. But it's something we probably need to talk more about when we go back. It's a question of Pan-Africanism. We've been talking an awful lot about anti-imperialism, this and that, but I think if we're talking about what social movement, what are we talking about if not for a Pan-African social movement? And then some of us would say, we would like to say a transformative feminist Pan-African social movement.
Well, Marjorie, Tanzania is often seen as the cradle of socialism in Africa. Mind you, I didn't say Africa's socialism in Africa. Do you feel that the tradition is being continued?
Well, first of all, I think what many people saw as a cradle of debate was actually the University of Dar es Salaam, in terms of critical analysis and debate and so on, very revolutionary kind of thought, and so on, very international, not just Pan-African and not just Tanzanian. Because I'm thinking immediately of the role of people like Walter Rodney and so many other people, John Saul, Lionel Cliff. Now let me think of some women counterparts. Susan Geiger, who was associated as a historian, not employed, but there are so many others. Tanzania as Tanzania definitely, I think, is one of the countries that attempted to practice an alternative to neoliberal or post-colonial kind of governance. I believe that under Nyerere we had major openings in terms of raising issues, and that it was not just a cynical manipulation. And there's no doubt about the fact that there was a major, if we remember that Tanganyika was a labor reserve economy, it was the least developed economically as well as in terms of education and all the rest of it. under the centrally planned socialist economy, it did make great strides in terms of industrialization. It paid attention to dispersion of growth poles into different cities, not just in Dar es Salaam. It paid attention to producing on the basis of what we had in terms of textiles from the cotton and all the rest of it. My husband's people are down in Songea, where in the past 6 months of the year they didn't have a market for their maize and other things. And that was a part of the push deliberately by the colonizers. That was a major source of labor for the copper belt and the Johannesburg gold mines. Well, under socialism and self-reliance, for all the problems there, people took to the idea of Ujamaa Vijijini. In fact, Ruvuma Development Association was a model. It was so successful that the bureaucrats in the party succeeded in getting it crushed. And what I know is that people who used to go to work on the sisal plantations, it no longer had to. And we had 1980. There was an editorial on the front page of our English-speaking paper saying there is a crisis of labor. In other words, the migrant labor system wasn't working. Why? Because the sources of the migrant labor force were in the locations where Ujamaa villagization really took off. These are the people that in the past have been deprived of access to markets, deprived of farm inputs and other support systems. And so they took advantage of the state crop support systems, which of course were contradictory, and the government was getting rent and all the rest of it. But if you're in a location that didn't have markets before and didn't get access to fertilizer, pesticides, whether we think if they're good or not, it was positive. And kids left school, and girls and boys, standard 7, they received 1 acre of 1 acre of food crop, 1 acre for food crop, 1 acre for cash crop, which meant that girls didn't have to push themselves into marriage. They were able. Anyway, a whole lot of things were happening. So there was, it did mean that it had an impact on the plantations. Why don't we pay attention to that? Why don't we ask more questions about why that happened? What was good in the process? Not, or maybe good's the wrong word, but what were the positive outcomes? Why is it that peak outputs in agriculture, crop by crop, for many crops, was during this period of time, and contrary to what a lot of people say?
You mentioned the Mwalimu. Wasn't he wonderful?
I'm a bit biased.
Yes, I am reminded of this phrase that I associate with it. He said, "Don't do as I say."
Eh?
He used to say, "Don't do as I say, but do as I do." I wish many African leaders would imbibe
Well,
that.
I was telling somebody, I was in a class last Friday actually, and I explained to the students, Marim Nyerere has the name Marim, not because he was a teacher at Puku Secondary School before he became the president, or before he joined the movement. And I remember he would have a 2-hour talk that was on the radio, explaining the terms. Oh, I know, because the topic was the terms of trade, along with other things. And he would go through, 5 years ago, it cost us so many bags of cotton, sacks of cotton, to buy a tractor. And now it costs this much. What do we do? This is what we're faced with. He was able to hold this country together through 7 years of destabilization by the donors. Yes, Tanzania was always well funded, but at the same time they were withdrawing it, pushing agreement to the structural adjustment. 7 years, Nyerere said no. 7 years our shops were emptied. People don't understand what we're talking about. That the shops were empty. You go into a shop, it's empty, nothing. So you get online. The joke is just like many other countries. You see a line, you draw into the line, and you ask people, what is the line for? Sugar, okay. Or a Congo, okay. Or kerosene. Hey, okay. So Malim was really Malim. He tried to have the people understand. Adult education, remember the success with which we don't talk about it, of the adult education campaign at that time, which got young people to leave primary school with their teachers and go and teach. And it was associated with campaigns, and one was Chakula Niwai, the food is health. Another one was in Kupanga ni Kuchagua, that to plan is to choose. And that was a context of a moment, I think one of our strategic plans was being created. So, of course, it never reached the ideal, but trying to get people in the content of the adult education to be relevant to a process of planning.
And now with neoliberalism, we don't talk about planning in Africa.
No, that's the sad thing. I know I've said to people, look, we're talking about industrialization. Where is the strategic plan? Instead, you have a shopping list, and you have a recycling of plans that have been going on year by year, but not a real strategic plan.
Marjorie, you are seen by several people, including myself, as one of the leading voices in women's rights in Africa.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I was just wondering, what do you see the future of women's rights in Africa?
Well, I think we have to be very careful because as soon as, in the 60s, Tanzania became a citizen in 67 and was hired at the university in 68, and it immediately became wrapped up in organizing at that time. There's a definite process now. Well, I shouldn't say all the time you've had different approaches to understanding women's rights and the struggle for women's rights. And I was with those who insisted from the beginning, including early organizing in the late 70s and 80s, that this is an interweaving of struggles over gender, struggles over class, struggles over globalization, or that's what we call imperialism. And that you can't separate it. And we used to call ourselves socialist feminists. That was under the WRDP.
Yeah.
Now we talk about transformative feminism. So right now there's a crisis. I think there's a crisis amongst ourselves. The donor funding is pushing people in a very, I call it neoliberal feminist position. On the one hand, you have a lot of money flooding in for studies on women and entrepreneurship. And what they call women's economic empowerment. When we talk to people, if I can give examples, it's all about individual stories of somebody able to build their own house and this and that. They're not talking about the empowerment of a class of women. Say, peasant women have been able to empower themselves as a group of people. They've been able to maybe create their own cooperative, raise the value of their crop, blah, 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 blah. Or even just move beyond that to challenge the state. And amongst ourselves, for example, there's a major division of approach in terms of how do we approach the debates about the Constitution. And some folks insisted, Women's Coalition, that they will, the way they put it is, they will join any agenda they will join forces with anybody as long as they accept our agenda. Meaning that you must put the issue of women's rights into the Constitution. This and that they wanted. They got it, but it meant that it was in the context where the government, through this constitutional assembly, it was called, which was the post version, it was the state's version basically, did away with all the earlier articles within the first constitution called the Warioba Constitution, but had safeguards to limit the powers of the executive, which strengthened the checks and balances between the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. 2-year terms only for MPs. MPs should not be ministers in the cabinet, etc., etc. So in other words, a liberal feminist force joins forces, and then when the new constitution was announced, our organization stood up and praised it, whereas those of us in a minority